What I'm interested in is the gap between the public person and the private self, and the sense of the gap between the certainty one sees, with the finished book, and the level of insecurity that the very act of writing comes out of.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see such a fabulous audience. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Enormous thanks to our sponsors for this evening, the Rathbones Folio Prize. I'm Tessa Hadley. I'm a novelist and short story writer, and it's my huge honor and privilege to be able to talk tonight to our star of the evening, the novelist Colm Tóibín. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. Colm has written 10 novels, 2 collections of short stories. He's written innumerable wonderful pieces of criticism and published books of criticism. And he's now added to that by also publishing a book of poetry, of which more later. He's won the Encore Prize, the Costa Prize. They've been shortlisted for the Booker several times, the Hawthornden Prize. Last year in December, he was awarded the lovely David Cohen Prize for a lifetime's achievement. And for the book that we're going to begin with this evening, his marvelous new novel, The Magician, he was awarded the Rathbones Folio Prize. And I have to also confess that I was the chair of judges for that prize, and that brings me the reward of sitting here with Colm tonight. I'm not going to spend lots of time reading paeans of praise to him, because the quality of the work and of his writing is going to come out over the course of the evening, and anyway, I expect you're mostly acquainted with that already, but I'll say, quote, from the review of The Magician in The Guardian, the intimate and the momentous are exquisitely balanced. Leo Robson, in the New Statesman, said that Colm was one of the most mature and had one of the most mature and measured prose styles in English, comparable to V.S. Naipaul and J.M. Coetzee, characterized by steadiness and an overwhelming cumulative power. And in her citation for the David Cohen Prize, Hermione Lee said that his novels and stories imagine their way into the lives and minds of others with amazing empathy and skill. He's a deeply perceptive writer who can also be lethally funny and daringly erotic. He's a truly international figure and a watchful historian of our times. He writes with the intensity of a poet and the lyric rhythms of a musician, and I think that puts it beautifully. We're going to talk for about 3/4 of an hour about The Magician a lot, and then also Colm's going to read from that and read from his poems. We'll start in a moment with a reading from The Magician, but first of all, if I can just say that at the end of the event, he will be signing books in the room opposite, and if at the end of the event you can wait in your seats while we make our way over there first. And also, Colm would like to read a sentence, a snatch, a fragment of Salman Rushdie's writing.
Just in solidarity with our friend and colleague Salman Rushdie, this is a simple sentence from his novel, The Satanic Verses. When you throw everything up in the air, anything becomes possible.
Colm, will you start by reading us from the beginning of the novel to bring its magic, the magic of the magician, into the hall?
In Brazil, there's a place called Paraty, which is in between Rio and Sao Paulo. And it's an inlet, meaning the water is very calm. And on that inlet, there's a house. And that house was where Thomas Mann's mother was born. There was great trade between Lübeck in Germany and Brazil, because Lübeck was and is the place where all the marzipan in Germany is made. So they need all the sugar. And a lot of Germans lived in Paraty, including Thomas Mann's grandfather. But he married a woman who was Brazilian, by which I mean that she was of mixed blood. And Thomas Mann's mother was her daughter, who came to Lübeck as an adolescent. So that he had, on one side, pure Hanseatic mercantile. They were solid people who were in business. They had owned warehouses, they owned ships. The Manns, they went back several generations. They were the essence of respectability and of a sort of conservatism. His father was a senator, and his father married this exotic woman who came from Brazil. And so this is a scene early in the novel. It's in the second page, where Thomas Mann and his siblings are children, and their mother Julia is describing her life to them. In the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, his brother, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, or what they were like, or what languages they spoke. A country many, many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter, and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine, and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reached back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did. And they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty was on the water, his mother would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible like the sun during the day. They're small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said sometimes you could read a book in the upstairs rooms at night because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. And you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about the ship. You must go to sleep. Tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar, but just a small part again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they're eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? You must ask your father that. Thank you. Thank you.
So you've made a novel out of a novelist's life, which is quite a strange kind of a novel to write. And probably people know that Colm has done this once before, writing his marvelous book, The Master, about Henry James. Tell us what impels you to take these stories of writers for your writing. It's a complicated transaction. What's it about?
Well, the first thing to say about it is I don't promise to do it again. I mean, I will not do this again, so don't worry.
That was my last question.
Don't worry who else I have lined up to treat in this way. I don't have a single person lined up. I promise not to do this again. I promised I wouldn't do it a second time. I broke my promise. I mean, the first thing is that it comes out of love. That when I was, I think all of us know this, that when you're about 18 or 19 and you start finding books on your own that are not in any course or your parents don't have them, but they're your books, that you can be really eaten up by a book. And that happened to me certainly when I read Henry James, and it certainly happened to me when I read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, Buddenbrooks, and Dr. Faustus. And really, in a period of a few years, I would have read all his work. And I knew nothing about him except that he was a German, but I wasn't even sure about anything else, really. I didn't know what was autobiographical or what wasn't. And I believed then that books were written by people who were, I suppose, entitled. And they were written out of power, a sense of power, entitlement, security, certainty. You saw a book, and it had the name of the author, a photograph of the author. It had a sense of completion. You thought, surely the person who wrote this meant business, knew what they were doing, got up in the morning, worked all day, and felt quite entitled to send this message, this book, to us readers who are different people to them. And of course, in the case of Thomas Mann, you can just imagine the problem that German scholars had who were working on his work. For example, Death in Venice, which has a sort of basically it's about an older man looking at a young man on the beach. And people presumed that was symbolic or was a metaphor or was about something to do with disease and desire and beauty and idealism. Well, when Thomas Mann's wife was in her early 90s, his widow, she dictated her memoirs. And she said, that's no problem. Tommy and myself were in Venice the year before he wrote that story. And yes, he did look at a boy on the beach all the time. And the scholars, of course, didn't know this because his diaries had not been published. He said in his will that his diaries were to be published 35 years after his death, but then he crossed out 35 and he put 30, but it was actually 25 years after his death, his diaries were published. And his diaries made clear that his erotic dreams, his secret erotic dreams were homosexual. That he was married, he had 6 children, but that when he dreamed about sex, when he thought about sex, he thought about men. And hilariously, Virginia Woolf has a description of T.S. Eliot that he wore a 4-piece suit. He was so overdressed, But Thomas Mann was always in a 3-piece suit. He would give long scholarly lectures to Germans that would last 2 hours on large subjects like Goethe's, dramas and Faust and Schiller and all those German things. And the audience would listen in wonder to him. But he'd go home and instead of writing marvelous, the audience loved me, I'm really great, he said, a young man in the 3rd row, I saw him watching me, I glanced back, I gazed for a moment, oh, what eyes. And this would be a constant in the diaries. And of course, the diaries shocked everyone. They shocked one of his children especially, but they didn't shock his wife. And that fascinated me, that Katia, who was married to him all the years, was not surprised by the diaries, that he had married someone very sophisticated and interesting and intelligent and tolerant.
There's a wonderful passage when they've sort of almost accidentally left Germany and the Nazis seize power and they can't go back. And he's in Switzerland realizing that these diaries are in a safe in his office. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah,
it's such a fascinating...
this was a nightmare because he didn't expect Hitler to rise to power so quickly. And so he's in Switzerland, and the children tell him, do not dream of coming back into Germany. And so he realizes that he's going to lose probably his 2 houses in Germany, probably his money in German banks, and probably also his relationship with the German language. And but he realizes the big danger is that his diaries are in a safe. Now, rule number 1, never put your diaries in a safe, because if anyone comes looking for them, they're going to open what's in that safe. And the Nazis did eventually ransack the house. And of course, the first thing they want to know is like Donald Trump, what's in the safe? And so he had to write to his son, Golo, who was still in Munich. He was going to leave shortly afterwards, to say, can you imagine having to do this to your son? Open the safe, Golo. Do not read anything that's in the booklets or in the stuff that's coming out. It's in the safe. Do not look at it even, and just wrap it all up and send it to me. Golo, of course, did this without knowing that the chauffeur was actually a Nazi spy. And Thomas Mann is in Switzerland waiting for this stuff to come. I mean, any of us who ever waited for a check to arrive in the post know this feeling of checking the postman, listening, And they didn't come, and he realized that if the Nazis got them and understood what they were, that they could ruin him, that they could send message around the world. This Thomas Mann has been posing as a respectable father, as husband, as a scholar. All the time he's been thinking about sex, and he's been thinking about sex with young men. And so he realized how close he came to being ruined. It seems the Nazis did look at them, but they didn't know what they were, because he'd already published Death in Venice. But it's I thought it was an interesting drama, of someone. He'd won the Nobel Prize in 1929. This is 33. So he was one of the best-known Germans in the world. And yet here he was, a sort of shivering figure, afraid of his own future because of what could be done to him, because of his secret sexuality.
You write that so powerfully. He has inner pictures of them mocking him and him becoming weak, which goes back to that thing you were talking about at the beginning of how he presents as a writer with such authority and such confident selfhood, and in a way the whole novel is unraveling that and showing how the art actually grows out of that fearful place.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. That what I'm interested in is the gap between the public person and the private self, and the sense of the gap between the certainty one sees, with the finished book, and the level of insecurity that the very act of writing comes out of.
Yeah.
So we're sort of exploring that big difference between. The other thing that had to be explored in a book, Henry James was born in 1843 and he died in 1916. And his life was, while there was war at either end of it, the American Civil War and the First World War, he didn't really live through a war in the same way as Thomas Mann lived through 2 wars. But the problem with a book like this is you do have to deal with this, that you can do all the intimate scenes you want, but eventually you're going to have to deal with the fact that this man's life and his family's life were so deeply affected.
They were so public. I mean, it's not the James family were affected by the Civil War. It mattered a lot. One of the sons was destroyed by it, really. But Thomas Mann is at the forefront of the German exiles, pronouncing on the war, and his children are telling him to be more extreme and so on. But just before we talk about that in a way, I want to try and get hold of what the writing of the book feels like, because there are all this stuff we know about Thomas Mann, and there's an awful lot of it, because we have the diaries now, and we have the marvelous novels, and we have all the biographies. At your desk, you've done all that research. What are you doing with it? Do you put the research away out of sight on the day you sit down to write, let's say, about the diaries being in the safe and all of that? How do you use your research, and how do you translate it into the beautiful world of your book?
With this book, I made a lot of mistakes. It's because I decided to tell the life chronologically using the form a biographer would use. That, if a scene happens, the scene before, it's all chronological. The problem is you have to leave so much out. The problem is that you think certain things are important in his life, but they're not important for your book. And you don't know yet sometimes what is important for your book. So 55,000 words were taken out of this book. And anyone who's reading should be grateful to...
That's a lot.
Because it was me showing off. It was me showing, look all the research I have done about classical music. I'm going to give you an enormous amount of stuff about this. And eventually, some of it just fell off the book. Just simply, it was like extra and it wasn't needed. But I needed an editor to tell me, this isn't working. But if you take this out here, the reward, the payback will be quite high on there. So there was quite a lot of work to get the book down. Not because it was too long, but because the long pieces were too boring. And I needed to dramatize. I mean, Henry James said that what novelists need to do is dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. And therefore, you're looking, I suppose, for the scenes that are most dramatic. And you've also got to watch the build-up to a scene coming towards the end, say, which is about his relationship to his son. But, you don't... If you don't know the story yourself very well, you can't tell it. So there's no point in checking a section from a biographer or from notebooks. You almost have to go blind each time into writing it, so that you're sort of, it's a character you're inventing, and what you're doing actually is creating an illusion. Now, a biographer is probably not doing that. A biographer is probably giving information, dealing with knowledge, dealing with footnotes, dealing with what we can prove happened next. What I'm doing is I'm attempting to create an illusion so that you, the reader, can actually enter into this world, that you're in the room, that you're in his mind, that you can see the world as he sees it. You remember what he remembers, you notice what he notices. You live as he did. And so the whole point of it is to bring it very, very, very close, using a system that I would call third-person intimate.
Yes, I was going to ask about that, because that's what, I mean, we are not in the first person, and it just wouldn't work if you were saying, I was listening to my mother's stories. I heard her say, why not? Why does the first person is a less sensitive instrument, isn't it, for this recording of the imagined, the illusion of the individual? Why is that?
Because if it's another person's voice, it's them speaking.
Yeah.
You're hearing them, and you are you, and they are them. And so it is a sort of conversation like that. If you use third-person intimate, meaning the point of view is strict, it can only be what he experienced, what he knew, what he remembered, with no author intervening to explain anything to you. So it's all entirely from his side. Now, the theory of this is that after about 30 pages, you should feel the world as he does. Once you're turning the pages, see the world as he does, feel what he feels, so that you're in him, even though it's third person, which wouldn't happen if it were first person.
It works.
If you
It's
can get
marvelous.
an intimacy from within, but you have to, the things to concentrate, well, you know this, to concentrate on it being from that person's point of view only.
Yeah, and you have no foreknowledge. That's really interesting in the book, because of course we, the reader, and you, the writer, know that the Nazis are going to come to power, that the Manns are going to have to leave Munich, and so on. But that never appears in that. We're always living at the point at which the future grows, and we don't know what's going to come next. So that's a very
that's a really good point, because that's why I chose to do it chronologically. Because it's really important for us to know that he didn't know the First World War was coming until about 2 days before. He didn't know Hitler was rising, and he didn't believe Hitler was ever going to win. And this book was being written at the time when I and people like me, who are important commentators, thought Donald Trump was a joke. And so, I mean, it was funny writing this book, realizing I've just been through what Thomas Mann went through with Hitler. Not knowing, not expecting, presuming a buffoon could never get elected in a country. Well, we know different now, and in a number of countries. So, yes, you have to keep it in real time so that he doesn't know.
Yeah, he doesn't know. In your criticism column, you're very brilliantly preoccupied with how families form writers. You write beautifully about Yeats and his father, and Joyce and his father, and Beckett and his mother. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you uncovered as you wrote The Magician, about how man was formed by his antecedents and his family? I mean, you have a little bit in reading the opening, but perhaps you can unpack that a bit.
I mean, the first thing, I suppose, is that Thomas Mann had 6 children. Now, I can't, as a writer, decide he had 5. Now, I'm sticking to facts in the same way as you might use scaffolding in the creation of a building. But if I say he was in Munich this year, then he was. If I say he had 6 children, then he did. But the problem, if I was giving advice to writers always giving advice to young writers, I would say don't ever have 6 children in a family, because it's far too many.
You must have wished he only had 3.
Yeah, 4 maybe.
Although you're fantastic,
4.
because all 6 are individuated.
It's getting out of bed in the morning thinking, oh my God, Monica hasn't appeared for ages in this book. People are going to forget she exists. How am I going to get her in organically without Rachel thinking, oh, he's just sticking this thing in just to remind us who Monica is. And
it never feels. I don't know how you do it, because I was aware. I thought, God, there are 6 people to keep going. Never mind the surrounding cast.
I mean, family planning would have really helped my novel.
But you can't help feeling that Thomas Mann had those 6 children as a work of art, the way they came in pairs.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
girl, boy, boy, girl. There was something like, if he wanted to be a big heterosexual pillar of society, 6 children would really consolidate that. Let's talk a bit about the family, and we'll talk about those children. But how about Katya? I mean, you mentioned this extraordinary, she was comfortable with his secret sexual imaginings. And she knew about that from the beginning. Do you want to read a little bit of Katya when almost the first time man who is published, but he isn't yet a big writer. He's a new young writer, but a bit celebrated in Munich. And he goes to the Pringsheim's home, which is Jewish but very assimilated, magnificently cultured and grand and moneyed, and this slightly less assured, well, a lot less assured young man arrives and talk to us about that and read to her.
Sometimes a stray remark can really help you. I asked the South African novelist Nadine Gordimer, she'd married into a famous German exile family, the Kasserers, who came to South Africa, who provided philosophers and art dealers and all sorts of art historians, and suddenly one of them married this strange South African girl who seemed to be sort of nobody, certainly in their world. And I said, how do they deal with you? And she said, oh, you don't understand. You see, I had written a novel, and for them that was everything.
Absolutely.
I thought, wow. So here's this Thomas Mann who's already published Buddenbrooks. So he's not rich, he's from northern Germany, he's provincial, but for this family, this is the most important thing you could do. And the hero or the young hero of his novel Buddenbrooks is called Hanno. And so he goes eventually. How this starts is that when he's young in Lübeck, in the north of Germany, a magazine has a photograph of a painting of these 5 children in Munich who are from this famous family. And he cuts it out like he would a rock star, puts it on his wall. And these are the Pringsheim children. So by the time he gets to Munich, of course, they're in their early 20s. And he keeps looking at them at concerts, and they keep looking at him because they know him as the author, and he knows them as the kids he had on his wall. And so he finally manages to get invited to their house. And here we go. And I have to say that Klaus, Katya Mann, she's a twin. Her brother is studying conducting. These are very posh people, conducting with Gustav Mahler. I mean, it's always that sort. They're at that level of things. There were, he guessed, more than 100 people at the Pringsheim supper, the first one he attended, with tables spread over several of the reception rooms. Most of these rooms had carved ceilings and inlaid paintings and murals. No surface was undecorated. He arrived, accompanied by the nervous young poet who had got the invitation, and the poet's aunt, the painter, who wore many glittering jewels around her neck and in her hair. The Pringsheim boys, especially Klaus and Peter, are a lesson to the youth of Munich, the aunt said. They are refined and civilized. They already have achieved such a great deal. Thomas wanted to ask her what precisely they had achieved, but as soon as they had handed over their coats, she moved away from them, leaving the 2 young men to linger in the shadows, watching the scene. A few times he caught Katya Pringsheim's eye, and while she seemed amused at his presence, she's about 20 years old, she did not acknowledge him directly. Once supper was over, he asked his friend to introduce him to Katya and Klaus, who are twins, who were standing in the doorway having an intense conversation. He could see Katya smiling as she interrupted her brother, putting her finger to his lips to stop him speaking. Although they must have been conscious that Thomas and the poet were approaching, they did not turn. The poet reached out and touched Klaus's shoulder. As Klaus looked at him, Thomas saw how beautiful he was. He almost understood why Klaus did not frequent the cafes in Munich. He would have been singled out and stared at. His politeness, the understatement in his tone, the neatness of his dress would have stood apart from the abrasiveness and the shabbiness then in vogue. Thomas, aware that Katya was watching him as he took in her brother, directed his full attention to her. Her eyes were the same deep dark color as her brother's. Her skin was even softer. Her gaze was unembarrassed. Your book is much admired in this house, Klaus said. In fact, we all fell out because one of us hid the second volume. Katia stretched lazily. He could see the boyish strength in her body. I will not mention the culprit, Klaus went on. My brother is tedious, Katia said. We call you Hanno, Klaus said. Some of us do, Katia said. We all do, even my mother, who hasn't finished the book yet. She has finished it. At 2 o'clock today, she had not finished it. I told her the ending, Katia said. My sister spoils things for people. She told me the end of Die Walküre. My father had already told us, and I was worried he'd find you hadn't been listening. Our brother Heinz told us the end of the Bible, Klaus said, and it ruined everything. My sister spends her life listening to our father, Klaus said. She actually studies with him. Thomas looked from one to the other. This conversation, he sensed, was their underhand way of laughing at him, or at least excluding him and his companion. He knew that on arriving home, he would remember every word they said. When he had cut out the portrait of the young Prince Hans from that magazine, this was what he imagined. A world filled with elegant people and rich interiors, with conversations going on that were both clever and oddly inconsequential. He did not mind that the decor was perhaps too rich, and that some of the people were too effusive. He minded nothing as long as these 2 young people continued to allow him to listen to them and watch them. Oh no, Katia exclaimed. My mother is being held in a vice-like grip by that woman whose husband plays the viola. Why was she invited, Klaus asked. Oh, because you or my father or Mahler or someone admires how her husband plays the viola. My father knows nothing about the viola. My grandmother thinks that there should be a ban on any woman marrying, Katia said. Imagine how different these rooms would be if people had only listened to her. My grandmother is halbwegs dumm, Klaus said to Thomas, as though he were confiding in him. She is very advanced. As they left the house, the young poet told Thomas that he'd asked his aunt if the Prinzheims were Jewish. What did she say? Thomas asked. They used to be, on both sides, but not anymore. They are Protestants now, even though they seem very Jewish. Jewish in a grand way. They converted. My aunt says that they assimilated.
Wonderful. There's a marvellous scene late on in the book when she's at dinner at Agnes Meyer's house in America, and anti-Semitic things are circulating around the table, and Katya speaks up with this eloquent rage.
Yeah. You see, until 1933, there were many, many families of that sort who had assimilated, who didn't go to the synagogue, who didn't see themselves as necessarily Jewish first. I mean, they saw themselves as German first.
Yeah.
Or as Bohemian first. But of course, Hitler had a different view. So that we watch his wife, in fact, becoming more Jewish. The more that identity is sort of imposed on her.
Yeah.
And so, there's a moment in Washington where someone says something about Jewish people. He said, don't tell me about Jewish people. And so, are you? Well, say, what did you think I was? And of course, it meant, of course, that their 6 children under Hitler's laws were considered Jewish. So, I mean, it really put them in danger, and her parents were in enormous danger.
Her dignified father, owner of that apartment lifestyle, he's stripped naked at the border.
Yeah, they lost everything. The only reason they didn't end in a concentration camp, her parents, oddly enough, is that the family had paid a lot of money to build Bayreuth for the Wagners, which is part of the sort of ironies and complexity around being Jewish and rich enough in Germany in these years. They were big Wagnerites. And Winifred Wagner protected them to the extent that she could.
Yeah.
But they didn't end up in a concentration camp. They ended up just having all their money taken from them, and he was stripped naked at the border. But they did get out to Switzerland, which was very unusual.
Tell us something about what it was like being one of those 6 children of Thomas. I think you beautifully poise your verdict in the book. In a way, the 6 children, or at least 5 of them, think it's awful having Thomas Mann for a father. But I'm not sure that's exactly what the verdict of your book is.
Well, Elizabeth Mann, who was the youngest daughter, I think she said the cleverest thing anyone's ever said about families, and I want to write it up on the wall. Which is that after 30, no one has the right to blame their parents for anything. I think that if only that could become,
Rather wonderfully, my 31-year-old son is in the audience. So, Jack, it's...
time's up. Time's up.
Yeah.
They were brought up in this household where, especially in the First World War years, when they were all becoming adolescents, Daddy was busy writing his book. Daddy was grumpy at the table. Daddy's a famous writer. Everywhere you go, people are going to say, "Oh, are you Thomas Mann's son, daughter?" And
what was that terrible? They called Klaus, his son, the subordinate clause.
W.H. Auden, who caused nothing but trouble in this book, referred to Klaus Mann, Thomas Mann's son, as the subordinate clause. And after the First World War, the two eldest Mann children, Klaus Mann and Erika Mann, he's gay, she's lesbian, they are the poster children in Germany for the new freedoms. After the First World War, after 1918-19, especially the years of the inflation, no one respects authority anymore in the way they did. So all that Kaiser, all that homeland thing is over. And of course, this will go two ways. It will go into pure bohemianism, what we call the Weimar, the sort of cabaret. And the other side, of course, will go towards Hitler, with no longer with any proper authority from either church or indeed state. And so the two Manns, the two eldest children, do whatever they like, say what they like, wear what they like, but they come home regularly like drowned rats looking for money. And Thomas Mann has to put up with this because, he's so repressed sexually, and they're so out there. And they're always about to marry people or go to Persia or tour the world. And, he has to put up with this. The problem,
whenever they come home complaining about what a nightmare it is having him, he thinks to himself, but I paid for your journey. I loved it that you've invented that.
Yes, that's father thinking, you say whatever you like, but I notice, that when you want money. But so, they, in a way, they suffered as his children, and in a way, they benefited enormously from that. And of course, their mother was always protective, sardonic, intelligent. I had a rule with the book. Every time Katia comes into the room in this novel, I must have her say something funny, sharp, intelligent.
Yes.
Do not leave this piece of dialogue without Katia Mann saying something interesting. And but I think the whole idea of your father being a famous writer, so you must be quiet. There's a scene later on where the boys are adults, and their father says something, and Golo turns on him, his son, and says, "Oh, I suppose you want us all to be quiet now because you're writing one of your books." Like there was a bitterness on the part of some of them over how they'd lived. The problem was, after 1933, how do you live then? He could live because he spent 4 hours every morning in his study writing. He had a very solid domestic life. His children's life was completely destroyed. Any sense of regularity or certainty was ruined. And they ended up sort of wandering the earth as sort of lost people. Erika, in about 1935, ran out of road because her German passport was up. And the Germans weren't going to renew it, so she was going to be effectively stateless. And she was at a party in Amsterdam, and she saw a little fellow over in the corner, and she knew who he was, because he was a friend of her brother's, and she went over to him. He was called Christopher Isherwood, and she said to him, "Now, I want you to marry me." And she was very grand and, very, very good at this sort of thing. And Isherwood said, no, my mother wouldn't like that. And my boyfriend, it would be complicated, but I know someone who would marry you. And they sent a telegram to W.H. Auden, who replied, "Delighted." And Erika put on a beautiful suit and a tie and got her haircut even shorter and went over to England, and she married Auden, which gave her a completely different life in the Second World War, which meant that she could work for the BBC. She was a British citizen. And it also just added enormously to the general spice of their lives that they had Auden to comment on.
There are some marvelous scenes in this novel where Auden comes visiting the Mann household in America, and it's so funny and terrible and funny. Colm, I think we should... I haven't half finished talking. One could talk about it for hours on end. But I think if we want to listen to some of your lovely poems, I think you should tell us a bit about the book of poetry. So I'm sorry, we're going to break off talking about The Magician, and tell us about Vinegar Hill.
I mean, one of the problems about finishing a book like this that you've been working on, that you're living with the written word so closely, that you're rereading chapters, you're cutting, you're adding. Every day you're worrying, have I got Monica, Michael, where's Michael? Jesus, where's Michael? That you, when it's over, it's gone. You think, what am I going to do now? And it started when I finished the other book, the Henry James book, The Master, where these little poems would come. They weren't always little, but I made them little. I sort of kept them. How strange, it would be like if you were a songwriter and a melody came, and you'd write down the melody. Think how odd this melody is coming out of the blue like this. And so, when of course this thing that we've just been talking about, when that was over, a pandemic arrived. And that meant that, not only had you no novel to write, but you were stuck in a room. And I was living with my boyfriend in Los Angeles, and we were like an elderly couple, and we were an elderly, I was an elderly couple anyway, I don't know about him. I'm not going to, but so I had some poems already written. And so there were periods, certainly it was a month or two, where I wrote a poem or started a poem every day in the evening, and I would work all the next day on the poem. Some of them didn't work. It's curious about what doesn't work. You just got to leave it. Sometimes you can't cure a bad beginning. Other times, you just go back to the image and think again. I think I'll just read one, because there's nothing worse than a long poetry reading. I mean, is there? And so one day, some of the time, if anything at all came into my head, it became a poem. So I was reading something, and the Latin phrase mysterium lunae came, which means mystery of the moon. I just thought, mystery of the moon. And then, we're hearing a lot about global warming and predictions over what we're not going to have in the future. And, a lot of our lovely landscape is going to be tundra by the time it's finished. And there's going to be no more, all the things we're not going to have. So I got thinking, you can't do this in a novel. Where, imagine if the moon disappeared. If news came that among the things that are going to go in the next decade is the moon. And we're just not going to have it. Global warming, it's gone into the ozone layers of the moon. It's completely unscientific. It couldn't work in a novel because people would just think, you've just gone mad. But in a poem, you could just pretend in a poem, for the duration of the poem, that there's no moon. So I just want everyone maybe think for a minute about, imagine if there was no moon, what there wouldn't. Anyway, this is the poem. Last night I saw that the moon was empty in the sky. The stars around did what they do. They are millions of miles away, or millions of years, and are totally exhausted. But the moon is blank, just a space to show where it might have been. We will tell whoever will attend that the moon used to catch light from the sun and waxed and waned, full, sickle, half moon, and the songs, blue moon, song to the moon from Rusalka, Moon River, the dark side of the moon and the melodies. It was all the rage once, the moon. It was a large step, a sad step for mankind. Soon the sun will run out of hydrogen and it will all be gone. The disappearance of the moon is just the start. I'm working day and night on my book, knowing it will be the final word on the matter. I will compose, with aid from scientists, a description in concise prose of the time before the bang, the gorgeous vacancy, the pre-astral soup, gravity dancing like a herring on the griddle, and the sly almostness of atoms and particles, and how long a neutron took to be certain that it was not a proton, and the war between infinity and eternity that would have gone on forever had the world oozing imminence not begun to roll with its built-in obsolescence, its sell-by date, its oomph, its ooh-la-la, its everything that is the case. It is calm here now. Waves have stopped, of course. The sea has settled down. Soon it will be a flyover state. There is nothing to compel its tides. At gatherings, they read Matthew Arnold's poem and marvel at the lines about the sea being calm tonight. What else is there? But it wasn't always calm. I can swear to that. I remember Redondo Beach and the waves high and the sun going down over the horizon. Strange, I have no memory of the moon. but it must have been there somewhere. But no matter what, you can look all you want, the moons in the past, like Analog, or the Western Seaboard, or the Library at Alexandria, or Sic Transit Gloria Mundi, a lovely old saying, long eclipsed by more fashionable tongues, that yet are speechless at the vacancy in the night sky. They're howling at the thing not there that we want back now, or at least soon.
That was the perfect poem to read at that moment. I think we must have some questions from the floor. If you put your hand up, somebody will come to you with a mic. And yeah, when you do receive the mic and it's your moment to ask your question, perhaps you could stand up, if that's all right.
Hi there. That was really very entertaining. Thank you. Do you think Mann was really in love with his wife's brother, and she was a substitute?
Oh, you see, it's never as simple as that, because it's around 1900, and there are certain concepts, the whole idea of sexual identity is not up for grabs like it will become, say, 60, 70, 80 years later. So that a man marries. I mean, it isn't as though there's a choice. I mean, there are bachelors around, but man realizes that he himself would not thrive in that condition as being an in-between person in a conservative society. He's a conservative man. So he's always going to marry her. But of course, he's almost afraid of the brothers mocking him, of the brother who, of course, we learn later, was himself later on known to be homosexual. So, it's something that, it's not as simple as saying he loved the brother and used her as a substitute. It is that for him, a man married a woman, and he was a man who was going to marry a woman, and his desires were going to be secret. So you have to work with trying to dramatize something that's like undercurrent, and that if you claim to understand the psychology of it, I think the whole point of being a novelist, and I think Tessa knows this better than I do, is that you cannot claim to know your characters as though you're a sociologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, to be able to put labels on them. The less you know sometimes about them, the more they will matter to the reader.
Yeah.
So that, there are moments when it seemed like you've described, but other moments where he actually almost got what he wanted, in that he got the respectability he craved, and he kept a bargain with her, which was that he didn't, for example, go out at night to cafes, or he didn't betray her in any open domestic way that she felt humiliated by.
She was the right wife.
Nobody else would have put up with him.
Nobody else would have put up, and it's perfect. It's a marvelous match.
Yeah.
Quite what was in it for Katya is another question, but you make
I don't know if that phrase has made its way into Scotland like it did in Ireland, where couples always say to each other, it's almost like the language of love, no one else would put up with you.
Yeah.
It's a very Irish way of looking at love.
Lovely. Another question? Yes, we've got one here.
Hiya, I hope it's okay to ask about this, but I recently read your essay about how you went through cancer, and also the account of the treatment, and it was such a vivid account. I was wondering how it might have changed your perspective on life, and also maybe your work, and maybe what you might write next. Sorry, big question.
It's okay.
That's great, because I wanted to ask him what he might write next.
Well, I got diagnosed with testicular cancer, and what I said in the piece was that my two testicles, they were so close to each other that they could finish one another's sentences. And, and now there's only one. So I don't know why, And it's very sad. The treatment for testicular cancer is particularly grim, because they found it at chemo early that worked, and they never refined it. So you're dealing with this really very fierce, aggressive chemo that has you in a state that's impossible for anyone who hasn't been through it to describe. So I had a go at describing, for example, music. I listen to music a lot. Music under chemo sounds like jumbled sound, confusion. It has to be turned off. You can't sleep. because you're on a lot of steroids. You can't eat, you can't drink, you can't listen to music, and you also feel an intense depression, a sort of anguish that only chemo people recognize each other. And you just, the next 5 minutes, I kept saying, I'm going to get through the next 5 minutes. Then I'll reconsider everything. And of course, some of it was very, very funny at the same time. The nurse, I don't know if you have the word here, the word pioneer in Ireland means someone who's a member of the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association, meaning that you wear a badge and you'll never drink again. And it's an alcoholics thing, becoming a pioneer. And the nurse said to me, are you a heavy drinker? Of course, I wouldn't admit that. I said, no, God, no. And she said, oh. And she looked disappointed. I said, why? She said, no, because you see, chemo is like, and she said, meaning that people who drink a lot are used to getting all sorts of poison into their system. She said, the people who suffer most are the pioneers. Oh. And I thought this was there were so many things like that happen. But, I like to feel that it made no difference to me. And it's almost a matter of principle, where you say, if I needed cancer to tell me how to live or tell me how to appreciate life, then there was obviously something really wrong with me before. And I love saying I just lost 6 months. And I lost a lot of hair, I lost a testicle, I lost a lot of self-respect. I mean, just being poked by doctors and nurses, spend your time having injections, isn't good for your general self-esteem, And anyway, I didn't feel I learned anything from it. I thought it was tedious. I didn't, for example, the phrase battling against cancer, I thought was rubbish. I thought the people in the kitchen were working harder than I was working. The nurses and doctors, everyone was working hard, the cleaners. I was just lying there like an idiot. And I didn't battle at all, I didn't have the energy. And then it was over. I mean, I kept asking stupid questions like, when are my eyebrows going to grow again? And they'd say, oh, they'll come back, and when will I be able, Anyway, I think the poems come out of that as well. There's the sheer relief at not having to bother going to sit in doctors' waiting rooms while they showed you your insides and said, look. You said, which part of me is that? And, I told one of them a joke. There was one doctor, I needed to get home, and I needed to get this doctor on my side so I could get out of the place. And I thought if I told him a joke, he might come around to me side. And it's that Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's son, had a tumor. And he went to a doctor and he had the tumor removed. And the tumor turned out to be benign. And Evelyn Waugh said, oh, they've taken the only part out of Randolph that isn't malignant. I thought I told the doctor this, but anyway, what I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to write a sequel to the novel Brooklyn, where it's 25 years later, and I promised I wouldn't do this. I hate sequels, except Godfather 2, and this isn't a mafia, But anyway, I'm writing it at the moment, and I hope to finish it by the end of the year, so that's what I'm doing.
We're all very happy to hear that. A question up here, I think, up at the top.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering about the difference in your writing between the novels such as Testament of Mary and House of Names, where you are given a skeletal narrative, and novels like The Master and the Magician, where you have much more biographical minutiae. Do you find either or of them harder to grapple in kind of creating characters or dealing with authorial authority when you have so much biographical information?
The Testament of Mary comes out of silence, comes out of the fact that Mary generally doesn't speak in the New Testament. And it just comes out of the simple idea, what if she spoke? What if she was an old woman and she finally got to say what it is that happened from her point of view? What would that sound like? How would it be? And the other ones were just a reading of the whole story of Orestes and his mother Clytemnestra and the murder of Agamemnon, and just starting to work with that, just to see what I could do with it. I have to say that some of this was written after I wrote a novel called Nora Webster, which is really a novel about my mother, which is set in a small town in Ireland. And I have a few of those novels, The Blackwater Lightship, Nora Webster, that when I finished them, there was so much drain, there was so much emotion put into them and controlled. There was so much personal stuff about loss, about people dying of the older generation in my family, that when they were over, I thought, I don't want to go back to that. I don't want another thing about Enniscorthy. I just want to be free. Would it be okay if I wrote about something else other than what had happened at home? And so some of those books, especially House of Names, really comes out of just the need to go elsewhere. But of course, it became a much more difficult book to write because of the amount of murder and violence and mayhem and misery. I thought, will I ever get away from all this? And a woman in Australia came up to me, and she seemed very nice until she spoke, and then she said, so how many people die in this book? And I had to say to her, I'm really sorry, but quite a number, And so this novel I'm writing at the moment is the first novel I've written where no one dies. And it's for this Australian woman. I don't know, I should have got her name and address so I can send it to her, saying, finally, I've got something for you for Christmas,
I think we've got time for another question. Anything more? I haven't got anything. Oh, I have got something online, but I haven't checked to see whether it's
Oh, it's online.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thomas Mann's well known in Germany as the writer of extremely long and complicated sentences that can occupy a complete paragraph. Did this influence your description of his character? And did you read Mann in German or English?
I read Mann in English. I didn't read Mann in German. I did not attempt to deal with these long sentences. I did not attempt to emulate them or copy them or parry them or do anything with them. His translations come to us early from a translator called Helen Tracy Lowe Porter, who you'll all be very proud to hear is literally, I'm not making this up, is the great-grandmother of Boris Johnson. And she lived in Princeton. And so I didn't deal with that matter. But I had to deal with something else, which is how do you do dialogue for Germans 100 years ago? Like, what sound do you give them? And in other words, are we going to have a parody of big, long German pieces of dialogue where the verb is in quite the wrong place? And are we going to do this? And what I thought I'd do is, since these were the 1920s, and these were fashionable young people who made a lot of noise in the 20s, to give it the sound of English dialogue that you might get in the 20s, where people, very short sentences, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, but Hemingway more than Fitzgerald, of short sentences, snappy interruptions, people attempting to be brisk in how they spoke, just to get away from. And I realized that this is troublesome, because when this got translated back into German, my little pieces of dialogue, the Germans want to, like, what could this is not how we speak, because we speak where the verb is in the wrong place, as I said. So, I did go counterintuitive on it. I did go away from what I thought was an elaborate system of prose writing into a simpler one, but particularly with the dialogue, where no one really gets to say more than a few words before they're interrupted by Katja, Klaus, Erika.
Somehow done it. Somehow, I actually can't read German either, but I feel the cadences of the Mann books are there, like a ghost presence, but they're not there. It's you. You did the same with the James, where the challenge is almost more extreme, except that it's in English.
Yeah.
But you solved the problem of those Jamesian long sentences by doing your rather declarative, shorter sentences. But the ghost of James and the ghost of Mann are behind.
Yeah, some people might argue if those James sentences are English, some of them,
They might.
Late Henry James, but anyway, I did my best.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, amazingly, at that very moment, the monitor says 0, which means we have no time left. So what a wonderful evening. Just one or two things before we finish. I know that Colm has something to recommend to you all. Before that, and before he says his piece, and then we thank him for a marvelous evening. First of all, thank you for being a lovely, huge, attentive audience and lovely questions. Will you wait for us after we've left the stage and just give us a bit of time to get over to the signing room? but you now want to mention this book.
Look, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I did an event this morning at 10:15. I presume a lot of people here were still in bed because I didn't see you all there. But it was an interview with a Nigerian writer, and this is his first book. And I promise you this book is very special. Damon Galgut, who won the Booker Prize with The Promise, wrote to me to say, I've read this extraordinary first book of stories by a young Nigerian who's called Arinze Efekandu. And this is called God's Children Are Little Broken Things. If you don't remember it, just look at the website for the festival. You see he was on this morning at 10:15. But I promise you this book of stories is really special. It's the first book, and first books are very vulnerable, especially first books of stories. Just read the first story. You've read the first story.
I've read the first story, and it is marvellous. It's very
so anyway, I'm just recommending this book. That's all I'm
Colm
doing.
is very generous to other writers, and that's a marvellous thing in itself, quite separate to his marvellousness in all the other ways.
But that book.
That book's a great book.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Can we thank Colm for a lovely...
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.